Hi, my name is Jessica Porras, and I'm the Senior Manager for Education and Outreach at CAQH Core. Welcome to our CAQH Core participant webinar on electronic healthcare attachments. I'd like to mention a few logistical items. A copy of the slides and the webinar recording will be emailed to you in the next day or so. Also, we'll have time at the end of today's program to respond to your questions. I encourage you to submit your questions at any time during the webinar by typing them into the questions panel on your dashboard. Today, we will start off with background and context for the approach CAQH Core has taken to help address the challenges associated with attachments. We will then walk through CAQH Core's efforts, including our goal, environmental scan, and resulting opportunity areas. Then we will spend some time on next steps as well as a call to action. And now let's get started. I'd like to introduce our first speaker, CAQH Core Director, Robert Bowman. Bob?
Great, thanks Jessica. Thank you and welcome. Good afternoon. And just as Jessica mentioned, we do want to provide some background and context for the work that we plan on doing for attachments through 2019. So if we go to the next slide, you can really see that there is some foundational concerns with attachments, and that really speaks to the fact that attachments are very, very costly to conduct in the current environment, because many of them are not done electronically, not done through EDI. We are continuing our work through attachments through our phased approach. As you can see, we've had many previous phases, 1 through 5 to date, looking at very specific components and challenges within the administration of healthcare on topics ranging from eligibility all the way to prior authorizations. So attachments is the next step in our progress in tackling some of the, again, some of the most costly, some of the most burdensome components of administration. If we go to the next slide, you can see that we actually do have data related to some of the components of attachments. But first, having this kind of basic understanding of how we categorize attachments and the methods for their exchange is important to understand. We see attachments as both related to claims and reimbursement processes, prior authorization, value-based payment models, as well as importance of audits. Providers are required to pull specific patient-specific information and supplemental data and provide that to a host of other entities within the spectrum of healthcare, including health plans, auditing organizations, and others within that cycle. The methods that providers and health plans and clearinghouses and auditing organizations use also varies quite a bit. It can be manual, so printing out, popping it into an envelope, licking the stamp, and mailing it in, to fax machines, which are very popular as well, to partially electronic. And we define partially electronic usually as a web portal interface, where a provider can log in, upload an attachment or part of a medical record or a form that has to be filled out and supplied to the other entity, usually the health plan, and submit that partially electronically. It's still manual for many components of it, but they can upload it and interject that documentation into a more electronic workflow on the receiving system side. To a fully electronic and integrated model or system, these are few and far between. There's still quite a bit of lag in the implementation of fully electronic, but there's been a lot of progress made in the industry. There's a lot of conversation in the industry, and we want to make sure that we are part of that conversation. We are engaged with those types of conversations, and we're looking at how to ensure that the workflow, both from the provider as well as the health plan side, can really take advantage of a completely electronic model, both with standards and operating rules, roles and responsibilities defined, and ensuring that we can progress from a manual to an electronic means of sharing this additional data and information in a most streamlined way possible. Now, if we can move on to the next slide, you'll see that we do track through a variety of different models and progresses, different progress that the industry has made, both when it comes to how they do it today versus where we can go for tomorrow. There are specific benefits for the use of standards in electronic submission of the additional documentation or attachments. This includes direct reduction in the number of claim denials for the additional documentation. It does protect PHI as it is being transmitted from one entity to the other. It does reduce very specific costs related to storage, materials, and scanner fax machine, especially the support of those technologies. It does reduce the time that it takes for payments to be made. We have some data related to that specifically, as well as to locate and submit the information, coordinate mailroom, monitor claim status requirements, as well as training requirements. There are savings for all stakeholders, so it's not just a win for providers or just a win for health plans. Everyone within, all the stakeholders within the continuum of the conduct of the transactions, of sharing this information through the attachments, all receive benefits in a fully electronic EDI model. There are a range of current standards and emerging standards that exist for attachments today. Many of us are probably most familiar with PDF and JPEG, as well as SOAP and HDPS. Getting a little technical here, but just different standards for the type of data in which it can be encapsulated in, and then how to share that data through the internet. There are also a number of standards that are emerging, that have emerged over the last few years and currently being used to conduct some of these transactions. Again, it's still a very small minority of the transactions, but X12, HL7, CDA, HL7 Fire, Direct, Connect, these are all new models or newer models and modes of both encapsulating the data within a standard and then sharing that standard via different means or connectivity with your trading partners. Also, it's important to know that as value-based payment models continue to grow and increase, the requirements, the data requirements that providers have on them to share information with health plans and with other intermediaries is continuing to grow and continuing to change and evolve. So we have to ensure that as we look at the modes for connectivity and the modes for attachment standards, have to ensure that they can meet the needs and requirements for these value-based contractings and payment models as well. If we move to the next slide, you can see that we have tracked through our index specific dollar amounts and volumes and percentages for attachments. And the latest index for 2017 that tracks attachments, you can see that a vast majority, 84%, if you look at the far right columns there, it's the lowest often for attachments for a fully electronic model. For medical, it's at 6%, for dental there, in the purple, it's at 13%. Where we have fully manual has much larger majorities at 84% and 86%, especially in comparison for every other administrative transaction that the industry uses, right? For eligibility or claims or claim payments or COB or remittance advice. Even PA is at a better rate than attachments today. So again, there's a huge potential savings for the industry to adopt specific standards, specific operating rules, and the specific workflows to help automate the collection and sharing of this data. If we go to the next slide, you can see that there is also some important information that has been shared through HHS's Unified Agenda. They have shared with the industry that there is an upcoming NPRM. The NPRM does have specific, the notice has specific information related to attachments, and this includes adopting standards for attachment transactions and electronic signatures used within the transaction. It does adopt operating rules that require acknowledgments to be used for eligibility, claim status, EFT, and the ERA transaction. It does adopt standards that require acknowledgments for claim status, enrollment, disenrollment, premium payment, COB, referral certification, authorization, as well as attachments. And lastly, also potentially modifying the standard for the referral or the prior authorization transaction from the 5010 version to the 6020 version. Again, this is the information that's contained within the Unified Agenda update. The NPRM is not yet out. We will notify all of our core participants as well as the industry. When that does come out, we'll be looking for you to help us define what any type of response that CAQH core members would like to have to the NPRM. So more to come on that. Again, very important for us as we consider the future for the development of standards and operating rules for attachments. Also important for us, if we go to the next slide, is to ensure that we, meaning everyone on the call today, both core participants and not, that we are in lockstep with the rest of the industry as we look at the attachment initiatives. So we do have a quick update for some of the more important and more active progress that many of these organizations are making today. We do want to highlight just a few of those for you. Beginning with X12, X12 does draft specific standard requirements and implementation guides for healthcare and other industries. They do have, for example, a 275 transaction that is important for the use of attachments. There are many models that require the use of the 275. Many health plans today have implemented it along with their clearinghouses and vendors support this transaction. We'll have to ensure that we work closely with X12 and the industry as they move forward with any sort of regulation, obviously, for attachments. Another player is HL7 and also the Da Vinci HL7 Fire Committee. They're also developing a comprehensive framework and related standards for the exchange, integration, sharing, and retrieval of electronic information, both as discrete data as well as attachments. So these are also important initiatives that we're paying attention to and members of and working with, obviously trying to collaborate with work that they're doing as well. We also collaborate and work with WEDI, the Work Group for Electronic Data Interchange. They also serve as a public-private industry organization to help provide solutions to critical healthcare problems, often through the form of industry education, through webinars, through conferences, as well as the drafting of white papers that are also become a cornerstone for much of the work that we do. We build on the work that WEDI does with their white papers and ensure that the industry can move forward with really progressive movement through our phased approach for developing operating rules. If we go to the next slide, you'll see a few other initiatives that we want to make sure that we highlight. This includes the guidance on implementation and standard attachments for healthcare transaction. This is a white paper that was jointly developed by WEDI, X12, and HL7, and it is also intended to be a resource to aid the industry as we move from a more manual exchange of attachments and the discrete data that is required to support many of the functions for administration to a more electronic, proficient, efficient method for data exchange. Again, we do have the link here for the paper. It's I would like to encourage anyone who hasn't read the paper to do so. It does have a blueprint for potential implementation methods, again, for modes of conduct of the transactions that are included, as well as some guidance for the industry on what to think as we move forward with any potential NPRM that may come out from CMS. We also have ONC, the PG Fire Task Force is a ONC convened group of payers, information technology, and healthcare organizations that are collaborating, again, to accelerate the development of HL7 fire applications to allow for that kind of API-driven approach for data exchange. Again, also very important for the industry to pay attention to the work that this organization is doing, as it really is accelerating the development of, again, API-based data exchange. Also, the IHE, the Integrating the Healthcare Enterprise, they also are promoting the coordinated use of very specific standards like DICOM and HL7 to really address the clinical needs and support for optimal patient care. Again, a little more on the clinical side, but also very important for us to pay attention to because they're really driving some of the data exchange, the data content requirements, exactly what needs to be shared, obviously for value-based payment models, as well as for the administration as well. So things we can learn from this organization are going to be important for us as we move forward. If we can move to the next slide, it's where I'm going to hand off the conversation to the core senior manager, Taha Jarawala, who will provide an update on our own efforts to date on attachment. So Taha, I hand the call over to you.
Thanks, Bob. So moving on to the next slide. As Bob mentioned earlier, right now there is no current HIPAA standard for electronic attachments, which is why there's a big burden in the industry. But as Bob highlighted earlier, from all the different work that the industry organizations are doing, the industry is like coalescing and moving forward together to kind of build and drive approaches to promote adoption of electronic attachments. And given CORE's mission and vision, solving this industry challenge on attachments is definitely a critical goal of ours. And using our integrated model and approach for rule development, we are pretty committed to providing industry-driven solutions via operating rules and also guiding materials on attachments. And just to highlight, over the past few years, we have collaborated with more than 250 different organizations to provide education and to gather insights from on the topic of attachments. For example, we hosted a bi-part webinar series on attachments, providing education to the industry on technical standards and also implementation experiences related to attachments. And most recently, which is kind of the focus of the remainder of the webinar, is we engaged in an environmental scan to identify challenges and discover opportunity areas to support attachment operating rules and industry guidance moving forward. I'll be walking through the opportunity areas we identified a little bit later in my presentation, but wanted to highlight that as we do this, CORE will keep its core principles in mind, which are listed on the table on the slide when we work to draft potential operating rules and guiding materials. As an example, we plan to build implementable rules that fill in gaps and build up existing industry efforts and standards, as Bob mentioned earlier, versus creating brand new approaches. So we want to build up the momentum of the industry versus creating things from scratch. So moving on to the next slide. So diving deeper into kind of our environmental scan effort. So, over the course of last year, we led an environmental scan to understand how the industry today currently exchanges clinical and administrative information. And we had about 40 organizations that participated with us and contributed insights into an environmental scan. And these included a diverse group of health plans, vendors, providers, clearinghouses, government agencies across medical, dental, and workers' compensation markets. So we did really try to get a good grasp of the industry from large and small organizations to get a true representation of the healthcare market. And our environmental scan studied the current state of the industry to find opportunities for CORE to reduce burdens associated with attachments. The exchange of clinical and administrative data, and how do we promote industry adoption of electronic attachments by identifying areas for potential operating rules that promote value and deliver ROI. And to understand primary reasons as to why the industry has delayed adoption for electronic attachments. We recently polled attendees on a recent webinar to identify some of these root causes. Not surprisingly, as we've heard earlier and repetitively, the majority of folks identified that they were waiting for regulatory direction from the government to mandate and adopt an attachment standard. However, almost a quarter of the respondents on this poll communicated that they were waiting for industry direction, meaning that these stakeholders would be willing to implement electronic attachment transactions into their systems if the industry as a whole would be able to convene and coalesce together on what standards to use. And lastly, I'd like to point out that less than 10% of organizations listed budget constraints for a reason for delay, suggesting that there is fiscal room for adoption on electronic attachments, meaning that I think as an industry at large, we need to come together and convene to really decide what would be the best approach. So moving to the next slide. So the attachments workflow is very primarily a manual process. and a source of significant administrative burden, and largely because there has not been a standard that has been federally adopted, as we've heard previously. And for example, as you can see on the slide, a regional health plan participating in our environmental scan indicated that it takes almost 792 hours, which is the equivalent of nearly 20 people working full-time to process attachments received by mail, fax, web portal, and just over the course of 1 week. So that data and that just kind of surmounts the burden and labor burden and also resource burden that attachments have in the industry. And this extended wait time for an attachment standard definitely fuels a sense of uncertainty and acts as a deterrent to innovation, causing stakeholders to question the value of addressing the attachments exchange. And our environmental scan suggested numerous reasons for this disconnect, which may be addressed, which all will be addressed over the course of this webinar. Just as an example, both health plans and vendors kind of pointed to the lack of a federal standard as a reason for delaying investments into kind of their IT systems to automate their attachment workflows. Just because as standards and requirements could change, they wanted to avoid unnecessary costs and resources spent into implementing electronic attachment systems. And then further, vendors also communicated that until there's a federal standard, variability in health plan attachment requirements make development of marketable electronic attachment services or systems problematic. So, there's lots of different variations from providers, vendors, and health plans on, the burden and the current state that they're in with adopting electronic attachments. Next slide, please. As part of our environmental scan, we asked health plans to report on the number of attachments received on an annual basis across all use cases, which include claims, prior authorizations, audits, and grievance and appeals. And only 50% of the health plans that participated in our environmental scan were actually able to provide us data. And the data they provided were only on volumes of attachments received via fax, portal, and electronic methods. And I'd like to note that none of the health plans were capable of estimating the number of attachments they received by mail. These findings definitely highlight that attachment volumes are very difficult to track, especially across manual methods, of which are the most common method of exchange, as Bob highlighted earlier from some of the index data. And as you can see on the slide, even without estimates of mail volumes, the number of attachments processed by all the other modes are very large. As an example, one of the national plans that participated in our scan reported that it receives almost 8 million attachments annually. And even some of the smaller regional plans reported that, that they receive up to 200,000 attachments on an annual basis via fax, portal, and EDI. So, and these numbers do not include the mail volumes. More data is definitely needed to fully articulate the scope of the attachments challenge. And we encourage health plans and providers to participate in our upcoming 2019 index study. If you're interested in participating, please, you can contact explorations@caqh.org for more information. I'd just like to put a plug in there for our 2019 index. Moving on to the next slide. In evaluating findings from our environmental scan, we were able to identify 5 opportunity areas that can benefit from uniform approaches in order to ensure industry-wide adoption of electronic attachments that deliver value and are successful. These 5 areas include workflows, data variability, exchange mechanisms, infrastructure, and utilities. I'll be providing details on each of these opportunity areas from highlighting, what the current state of the industry is to recommended approaches in order to resolve these industry challenges over the next few slides. So on the next slide, attachment workflows drive significant administrative operation in healthcare provider and payer offices. For example, a specialty group practice office reported that 2 full-time employees are needed to support the managing and processing of attachments generated on behalf of its patients. And this does not even include other costs altogether, such as the need for postage, other supplies when mailing and gathering attachments. So our environmental scan identified two significant industry challenges related to attachment workflows. The first challenge being the persistence of manual workflows, and the second covering solicited and unsolicited attachment workflows. Health plans are faced with significant operational burden when managing attachments received via manual methods. They have to collect from collection, processing, scanning, reviewing, and storage of documents, and nearly 80% of attachments are received via these manual methods. So you can imagine the amount of burden that is needed to manage that process. As solutions shift from mail to kind of more partially electronic methods, web portals do exist to help manage some of these administrative transactions, such as claims and prior authorizations. But what we've heard from feedback from our environmental scan is that many of these portals do not actually have the capability to accept the electronic attachment with the associated transaction. And as a result, a lot of times providers have to drop to using more manual methods to send the documentation. So providers are then faced with a disconnect and frustration and having to use two different methods to facilitate the exchange of information. And then as the industry transitions to more electronic attachment workflows, there's a need for effective workflows to be in place across all stakeholders to ensure there's value driven across the attachment exchange in order to ensure its success. So on the slide, you'll see there's two visuals of two common type of attachment workflows. There definitely could be more, but I wanted to highlight some of the two common workflow use cases. So the first workflow is the solicited workflow, which is a multi-step process and is designed to ensure inbound documentation is a better match with a health plan's needs to adjudicate a claim or prior authorization. And in this solicited claim attachment workflow, a provider submits a claim, could be via an X12 837, and then a health plan then sends a request for additional information to the provider, which is done via the X12 277 RFAI. And then with this, the request for additional information defines the type of documentation that may be needed to adjudicate the claim. The provider then sends the requested documentation back to the health plan in an electronic format. It could be in the form of the CDA, PDF. It could be other standards as well, such as image files. But the challenge kind of with this process identified by providers is that the workflow is that solicited processes often do not occur in real time, and often result in pending responses that await review by health plans. And this time frame and the delay really causes delays in revenue cycles and estimating when reimbursements can occur. And looking at the next workflow, the unsolicited workflow, this is where a provider submits an attachment concurrently with an associated claim or prior authorization also. But the challenge with this workflow, as identified by health plans, is that oftentimes, they receive too much or too little or the wrong types of information by providers via this method, which could cause burdens and delays in the processing of a transaction. So as you can see, both different workflows and both different challenges, unique challenges presented with each. And going beyond, just fee-for-service transactions, and as care delivery shifts into value-based, the industry definitely needs to be cognizant of these sort of attachment workflows, as we would want to, as care coordination needs to then be needs to occur in real time in order to support effective care coordination. So moving into the next slide. To address some of these workflow challenges that I mentioned earlier, we've identified 4 kind of opportunities for the industry to consider in order to promote meaningful electronic attachment workflows. The first recommendation would be to enhance the unsolicited workflow process by embedding documentation lookup requirements across all use cases, meaning that at the time of a provider submitting a claim or prior authorization, the provider would know exactly which document to send along with the transaction, which would then alleviate any sort of guesswork or unnecessary manual processes. Our second recommendation would be to encourage the real-time information exchange for solicited processes. We believe this would bring value to providers and health plans to ensure information is being exchanged in a timely manner. And as we go into more value-based care, this could prove to be very important. And the third and fourth recommendations address industry engagement and education around workflows. We believe to ensure we want to ensure and provide stakeholders with knowledge, tools, and also resources in order to make improvements into their workflows. So on the next slide, I'd like to talk about our second opportunity area, which is data variability. And by data variability, we mean the degree of which data has been shared between parties that diverge from expected structural norms. Data may be in a non-uniform format, or it could be in variable sizes, or data may diverge from the type of submission pattern or the naming conventions within the data or the metadata within the data. And we've identified two challenges related to the topic of data variability. The first is related to reassociation of attachments to a companion administrative transaction. And the second is the use of unstructured file types and file sizes. So in relation to the first challenge of reassociation, when attachments are not submitted in parallel with their companion transaction, for example, a claim with a claim attachment or a prior authorization with a prior attachment, there's problems with the transactions getting linked or being reassociated, especially in the case of a solicited attachment workflow. So given the scale of inbound attachment operations, for health plans, matching an attachment to the correct administrative transaction can present a particular challenge. Also, while many transactions are now automated, most attachments, still today arrive as paper documents, meaning, matching processes often require some level of human intervention. Oftentimes, documents may be unreadable by health plans due to poor quality in the printing or faxing of information or errors in kind of OCR technology. So, these issues often cause a breakdown in the attachment workflow, and unreadable attachments may result in the inability to reassociate documentations, which then result in pending requests or delays in adjudication. The chart on the screen kind of highlights the various data formats that are processed and received by health plans and vendors, highlighting the variability in the receipt of various file types. So for health plans, PDF and image files make up more than 50% of received data formats, and more than 2/3 of attachments received by health plans are saved in an unstructured file type. And then in order to kind of promote and support industry transition to more automated electronic attachment workflows, health plans participating in our SCAN emphasize the need for wider adoption and support for structured file types such as CDA, which really help with creating automated electronic and auto-adjudication systems. So on the next slide, I'd like to kind of to address challenges with data variability for attachment transactions. We've identified 3 opportunities for the industry to consider. The first recommendation would be to explore the value of potential operating rules to streamline how attachments should be linked to a companion transaction, such as a claim or prior authorization, via defining requirements for that reassociation. The second is to ensure that the metadata provided within the transaction is accurate and consistent across information exchanges. And our second recommendation would also be for the industry to consider defining, what those predetermined metadata or data sets should be, and use those across all different use cases and exchange methods. And then our third recommendation would be to encourage the industry to coalesce on and around identifying requirements for file types, sizes, formats, and use for attachment data. We think that this would help address challenges around quality, readability, and size efficiency of additional documentation received. So moving into the next slide, I'd like to talk about our third opportunity area, which is exchange methods. And by exchange methods, we mean how information is transported from provider to payer and across clearinghouses and vendors. And generally, these methods can encompass manual methods, which include mail and fax, partially electronic methods, which could include health portals or web portals or any sort of proprietary solutions, or even fully electronic transactions. As we wait for a federally adopted electronic attachment standard to be mandated, we see that this has led to a proliferation of options for attachment exchange, leading to the development of numerous web portals, proprietary services, and created a challenge for the industry by enabling a multitude of exchange options, with really no one common standard or method to share information electronically. And only a small number of health plans have really fully electronic submission methods available for providers. And this aligns with findings from the 2017 index data we heard earlier, and that only 6% of attachments are being tracked as being sent via electronic methods. Although we see low pockets of electronic attachment adoption that have been identified, most of the health plans participating in our environmental scan have indicated that they are planning to or are already piloting capabilities to support at least one electronic exchange method to automate the request and submission of attachments between health plans and providers. Several of these electronic standards being piloted include the use of the X12275 transaction, and also the use of the HL7 FHIR standard as well. Moving to the next slide. So to address challenges on how do we standardize attachment exchange methods, we've identified two opportunity areas for the industry to consider. So for electronic methods, the first recommendation would be to consider the use of industry standards to facilitate how electronic information should be exchanged and structured. For example, requirements for using web services could be beneficial to establish a base of how systems could connect and share and exchange information. And then followed by the need to standardize how attachment information should be transported and formatted. And examples of this could be pairing the 275 transaction with a PDF or a CDA, alternatively use of the HL7 FHIR standard with a CDA. So, there are different combinations that could occur, but I think in order to make address the attachment problem and make it successful, I think the industry needs to help work together to coalesce on certain standards that would be best practice. And as other exchange methods still hold a strong presence, such as the use of web portals, we definitely think there's value in bringing greater uniformity and consistency to web portal transactions. As recently, CORE drafted a web portal rule for the prior authorization transaction, demonstrating that there is alignment and business need for web portal requirements. So moving into the next slide. Our fourth opportunity area relates to infrastructure, and infrastructure really refers to the fundamental instructions that every data exchange system needs to work, such as on how to connect with other systems, negotiate security protocols, and the basic expectations for how the communication of transactions. The first challenge we identified is the lack of clinical and administrative system integration, the second challenge being the lack of communication, and the third is around the variability of timeframes being the third challenge. So attachments uniquely combine data from really two disparate systems, clinical and administrative systems. And as an example, from our environmental scan, providers indicate that they have to use a practice management system to generate either a claim or prior authorization, but then may have to pull clinical information from an electronic health record to support an attachment. And from our interviews, providers reported the lack of the integration between administrative and clinical systems as a challenge. And in order for the industry to implement and have electronic attachments be successful, stakeholders, must work together to resolve these interoperability challenges by establishing common rules of how systems should connect, share, and secure data. And then once systems are able to then connect and share data effectively, communication is kind of the next vital step. When information is exchanged, communication should be acknowledged. And oftentimes, providers are left in the dark, not knowing if information sent was successfully received. And findings from our environmental scan kind of help support that, in that health plans, acknowledge the receipt of attachments only 25% of the time. And the inability to communicate acknowledgments may lead to resubmission of additional documentation, follow-up phone calls, or other unnecessary follow-ups that lead to increased burden across the payer and provider spectrum. And then in looking at time frames to adjudicate an attachment, stakeholders do not have common expectations for turnaround times. Most providers that we interviewed in our environmental scan indicate that delays in adjudication of claims attachment transactions have not delayed patient care. But in the cases of prior authorization use cases, we had one behavioral health provider indicate that patient care was delayed in almost about 40% of cases as a result of additional documentation requests. So you can see, that there's varying burden across the use case, and that, there's importance for the need for timeframes. And as we move into the next slide, we could see that although response times vary greatly across exchange methods, there really is strong alignment around the value of fully electronic transactions. So as you can see, during our environmental scan, we asked providers to estimate adjudication timeframes for attachment-related transaction. And on average, providers reported that health plans take about 44 days to adjudicate a claim, with attachments sent by mail, 16.5 days by fax, 5 days by portals, and 2 days by EDI. So in looking at kind of the value of where electronic attachments brings, timeframes for approval are improved almost 22 times faster when using electronic methods over mail. So on the next slide, as in all other prior phases of operating rules, CORE has addressed key infrastructure needs for each transaction that the rules support. And in addressing infrastructure challenges related to attachments, the same common infrastructure requirements apply, such as the need for common connectivity and security frameworks so systems are able to connect and share data. And further, operating rules for acknowledgement, response time, and system availability are also important to ensure systems are securely open to the exchange of electronic attachments, and that communication and acknowledgement needs are being met. We've summarized these key infrastructure needs as part of our 2 recommendations listed on the slide. So moving into the 5th and final opportunity area, which is utilities. And utilities are, a single source of truth of resources maintained for the use of industry by a trusted party capable of facilitating collaboration and driving consensus among parties. So stakeholders participating in our environmental scan identified 2 recurring challenges related to utilities. The first being non-uniform documentation requirements, and the second being the lack of transparency. The variability and the lack of transparency in health plan attachment policies and the frequency in which the policy changes occur pose an administrative challenge for providers and vendors. Providers reported that documentation requirements change and are non-uniform from plan to plan, or even within the same plan, as various insurance products from the same plan even have different requirements. For example, to obtain approval for a certain procedure or a claim, one health plan may request to see images or x-rays, while another may request progress notes. So even with varying documentation requirements between plans, providers have reported that this information is not made readily available. And from the perspective of the vendor community, we've heard that vendors have stated that non-uniformity and the lack of transparency definitely makes it more difficult to develop, support, and maintain solutions that support electronic attachment exchange to really help reduce the manual burden, but also improve electronic exchange of information. So moving to the next slide. So in the case of attachments, there is definitely a need for common resources and tools to be shared amongst users is definitely important. We have identified two types of recommendations on how to build greater transparency and uniformity with documentation requirements for attachments. The first recommendation calls for the creation of standard companion guides so that requirements are outlined and structured with uniform flow and format across all health plans. This would help reduce burden in these application and system development for electronic attachments. And the second recommendation calls for building transparency and identifying common services that often require additional documentation. Having this information defined and available helps improve the overall attachment workflow. And with that, I've highlighted key findings from our environmental scan, and I'll now turn it over to Bob to talk about kind of what's next for CAQH Core on attachments.
Great, thank you, Taha. And as you can see in the call, there are potentially a number of things that we can work on as an industry group to address some of the biggest challenges related to additional documentation and attachments. So on the next slide, you'll see that we have done a lot of work to start this initial project. We do understand that as an industry organization, we really need the rest of you to help us move forward with some of the progress that we've made today into making potentially a set of operating rules related to additional documentation and attachments. We do know that attachments really is opening the line of communication directly between administrative and clinical systems. A lot of that integration is still to be built, is still to be developed, and still to be understood in a way that is meaningful for all of our constituencies as well as for the participants on the call. So we need to have folks probably from both areas really understand those systems, those limitations, what the data needs are, what the data requirements are, where is the best source for these data points, as well as ensuring that the industry organizations that are part of our process, we do need to have plans, we need to have providers, we need to have vendors and clearinghouses, and working together we can make sure that we have very successful outcomes as we look towards improving the healthcare system. It's long been that the visionary leaders have worked together to do this, and again we're calling on you to step up and be again part of the leadership for CAQH Core on this particular initiative, to ensure that we can and change the model that is really today very manually based, very paper-based, fax-based process today. I know we had some anecdotal information from our environmental scan, of which you'll see much more of that soon with our release of our white paper. But if one plan is receiving 8 million documents every year, multiply that by every other plan, by every other provider that's submitting those types of documents in a manual way today, because very few of them are coming through a fully electronic or even partially electronic today. So again, looking at how we go about developing operating rules with the input and feedback from our core participants, building off the information that we've had from our environmental scan is going to be really important for us through 2019. So again, our call to action on the next slide, again, looking at what we've done as our environmental scan, we plan on building off of that with additional training materials and guidance materials that we'll be sharing with the industry throughout the year. We're looking to build implementable solutions for the industry to take a phased approach and look at things through that scope and that lens. Again, we often go with the 80-20 approach with what can we do that can have a significant impact in this particular phase, and know that we will make a progressive step forward with each progressive step that we do take. So the focus for 2019 will be identifying the key themes, the workflows, the common barriers, the best practices, the strategies that we can approach many of these with. A lot of this will be information that has come from our environmental scan as well as our white paper, where this is a little bit of a preview with what Taha shared on the call today with you. Much of this will be blown out and spelled out in much more detail with much more data within our white paper, which we published next month. the other next future steps that we need to consider is not only the NPRM that may be coming out addressing attachment standards and operating rules, as well as other standards like like acknowledgements. I think it's important for the industry. We'll have to make sure that we're kept abreast of what's going on in the regulatory world as well as we progress forward in 2019 with our work on attachments. But we are also going to be launching an attachment advisory group and then subsequently a subgroup. Now, the advisory group will be a subset of core participants and industry leaders that are working currently on the topic or have a lot to say on these topics, and many of you do. So let us know if you are interested in working on our advisory group or if you prefer to work on our subgroup. We will be building up our rosters for both of these groups in the short term. Again, as we're looking through the NPRM and the white paper, the impact that these conversations have, on our advisory group will be really helpful. So again, if you're engaged in the industry on these particular topics, you want to work with us on developing the next set of operating rules to tackle this topic. It will be really important for us to ensure that you're a participant in either one of these groups. With that, I'll hand the call over to Jessica. We do have a couple of polling questions that we want to get from this particular group, so you can let us know your thoughts on these. So Jessica, I'll hand the call over to you.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you, Taha, for making this next poll an easy setup. So we'd like to hear from you, and I've launched the poll there. We'd like to hear, there we go, if your organization's interested in getting involved in our efforts. We've talked about the challenge that the industry at large has, and so we'd love your engagement. And be prepared for follow-up from us. I see a ton of interest, people who are saying yes and folks who want more information. So we really appreciate this coming from our core participants, and we'll be following up with you, and this will be very helpful. I'll take a few more seconds and then close the poll, and then I think what I'll do is I'll move on to the next poll. Great. Sorry. All right, so let's move on to the next poll. So as you know, we had an education series in the last year or so, and it was very well received and very well attended. So what we want to hear from you is what topics would be helpful? What should we be talking about next in an education webinar? And we typically have guest speakers who join us and talk about various topics. So I'll keep this open for a few seconds. And what I will do is share. I'd like to share with the audience, what the more popular topics are. Let's go ahead and close and then share the results. And I'm curious, from Taha or Bob, I know that the HL7 solicited and unsolicited, HL7, the federal mandate, and the other X12 topics related to attachment seem to be the most of most interest to this group. What do you all think? Is that sort of in line with what you thought?
Yeah, so that definitely aligns with some of the findings from an environmental standards where a lot of organizations are really looking to pilot or really identify some of the standards in use. And the X12 275, what that pairs with some of the workflows, it's definitely highly considered. And also, as HL7 fire definitely emerges, I think a lot of folks are really interested to see what the value that brings. So I think it definitely aligns with some of the experiences that we've heard from organizations in our environmental scan.
Yeah, and for that 10% of you that said other, either in the questions panel or you can email us directly, we'd love to hear your feedback of what other topics we should be doing education on. Okay, so with that, I think we have a little bit of time for questions. And I know we've already received some questions, but you also have a few minutes to write them down. So we did receive one question, which was, how and when will the white paper be released? We did get a couple questions about that. Tana?
Yeah, so as Bob mentioned earlier, we are looking to release and publish the white paper early next month in early May. So be on the lookout for that. If you're a core participant, you'll definitely receive an email kind of with that information.
Yeah, and it'll be in a place of prominence on our website as well. So we've run out of time. I'd like to thank you for spending an hour with us talking about this important issue. And if you have any questions about this or any of our initiatives, those are ways to reach out to us. Thank you very much. Have a great afternoon.